Hi there, everyone. Thank you for listening to TATTS Podcast today. This episode is very different from the other episodes we have done so far. It's not about the country or a particular culture. It's about the adventure of a lifetime. It's about the Mongol Rally. Our guest today is Scott Gurian. He has a podcast called Far From Home, where in Season 1 he tells the story of that journey. So just for you to have an idea what the Mongol Rally is, let's listen to a trailer from his podcast.
So you want to hear about my trip, I guess?
Yeah, I'm dying to hear about this trip. And I swear to God, Scott, if you're just going to tell me you're going to the moon, I'll just cry.
No, I'm not leaving for the moon, but probably going to somewhere almost as remote as the moon.
Oh, God. I'm feeling anxiety for you right now, and you haven't even told me yet.
Over the past few months, I've been telling all my friends about this massive road trip I'm taking with my brother this summer. We'll be driving more than 10,000 miles.
Wait, what is 10,000? I can't even, wrap my head around 10,000 miles.
I think it's like a quarter of a way around the Earth or something.
What?
Over about 7 weeks, we'll drive across 18 countries, 8 time zones, 5 mountain ranges, and a few deserts, raising money for charity. And we're going to do it in a really tiny car.
Where?
We're starting in England, and we're driving to Mongolia.
Oh my God!
Wow, that sounds so interesting. Something that we would love to try someday. So let's learn more about the Mongol Rally. Hello, Scott, and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you, and we're pretty excited to talk about this. So could you please talk about yourself first, and what do you do, where you're from?
Sure. My name is Scott Gurian. I live in northern New Jersey in the United States, just outside of New York City. I grew up here, but I've also lived at a number of other places, including in Boston, in Washington, D.C., and I even lived for a few months, a few years in Oklahoma, in the middle of the country near Texas. Mm-hmm. So I've lived a bunch of different places. I've also traveled to, I think, about 40 or so countries around the world. I'm a journalist, and I have a travel podcast called Far From Home. So I've documented my experiences and my adventures around the world through my podcast. And I guess today we'll be talking about one of the big trips that I took, which actually the day that we're speaking is actually the day after the 5th anniversary of me starting out on this big road trip I took with my brother and some friends where we drove all across Europe and Asia. So I guess we can talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So it was 5 years ago in 2016, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so could you please explain what the Mongol Rally is and some main rules?
Sure. So the Mongol Rally is an event that happens every year during, of course, non-COVID times, where there's usually a few hundred teams of people from all around the world. And when we went, they started out in England, in the southern UK. Now I think they start out in the Czech Republic. But they go on this crazy road trip all the way to, now it ends in Ulan Ude, Siberia, which is just north of Mongolia. So basically there's a place where they start and there's a finish line, and they have to buy some kind of car to drive or use a car, that they have to get from one place to the other. But it's not a race. There's no winners or losers, and there's no set route. You basically choose your own route in between. So people go all sorts of different ways. And you don't go together with the other groups. You all start at the same place, end at the same place, but you basically figure it out on your own along the way.
Wow.
And so the route that we took from England to Siberia, just north of Mongolia, it was about 11,000 miles for us, which is 18,000 kilometers.
Wow.
And it took us about 7 weeks, 52 days, and we drove all southeast across Europe, and then across Turkey and Iran and Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and then Russia, a little bit of Russia and Mongolia. So we got to see a big part of the world that I had never seen before. I didn't know anything about. That Central Asia was like a black hole in my geographic knowledge. I knew nothing about that part of the world or what country. I didn't even know the names of all the countries. So I got to see a lot. It was really an amazing and memorable experience.
Yeah.
And the other big rule of the event is that they make you take a little tiny car. They actually limit the size of the car's engine. So we took a little tiny, it's a Nissan Micra. It's like a little hatchback vehicle that I guess people drive in the UK, that usually like someone will have it they live in the middle of London and they'll use it to go get their groceries or something. It's not a car that you drive across mountains and deserts and, So it was a tiny car, there's a challenge of fitting all of your gear in this small vehicle. And then also, we bought this used from some guy in London. So it already was a little bit old. I think the car was a 2001 car, and then it had a lot of technical problems. Because it was such a small car, it actually didn't have air conditioning, which was a little bit difficult driving across places like the desert in Iran or in Turkmenistan, the Karakum Desert, which is like the hottest desert in the world, without air conditioning. We just had to have the windows rolled down and stay cool as best we could. And then we had a lot of mechanical problems, a lot of radiator issues. We broke down a lot of times. We were in tons of mechanic shops. So it was kind of a miracle that we ended up finally, making it to the finish line, because there were many times where we thought that we would not be able to keep going, that we would have to abandon the event and fly home. But somehow we kept our car going. Every time we would lose hope, but then it would start running again. And we ended up making it after 7 weeks. And so it was quite an accomplishment in the end.
Yeah. So you can't have a 4x4 car like a Land Rover or Jeep, right?
Right. Yes. They limit the size of the car's engine, so it's 200cc. I think they say. I don't know a lot about cars, but it's basically you're limited to getting a small vehicle. With that, you can't just take a 4x4 truck or so. Or the exception is you could take a vehicle if maybe it doesn't have a small engine, but it's something that's really unique. Like people have driven taxi cabs. Someone drove a double-decker bus one year. Some people actually go on motorcycles, believe it or not.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, if you have a really unusual or unique vehicle, they'll let you take that as well. But for most people, yes, they limit the size of the engine. And the thinking behind that is that if you have a small car, it's going to be more of a challenge, and you're more likely to break down, and they want you to interact with the local people. They don't want you to just zoom through these countries. They want you to have interesting experiences along the way, which makes sense. I understand it, except we had so many mechanical problems. If we had broken down maybe 2 or 3 times, I understand, okay, it adds to the experience, but we ended up breaking down, I don't know, I've lost track, like 8, 9, 10 times, and by that point it gets to be kind of annoying and very expensive for the car repairs, and we end up wasting all this time kind of stuck waiting for the car to get repaired when we'd much rather be meeting people or doing cool adventures. So but that was just unfortunate. We had no way of knowing when we got our car. We got it checked out by a mechanic. There were some minor problems they fixed at the beginning, but they thought it would be okay for this trip. But we just ended up getting very unlucky. This was my brother and myself. But then our friends Rosie and Jane were in a separate car, the same kind of vehicle as ours, and they had very few problems. So we just got very unlucky.
Yeah. And who can participate? Anyone?
Oh yeah, anyone who wants to join can do it. There's just a registration fee, and they want you to raise some money for charity. So we had like an online crowdfunding campaign, and yeah, as long as you follow the rules and you pay the fee and raise the money you need to raise for charity, anyone can participate. And this event, that the group that puts on the event, they're called the Adventurists. They're in the UK. They plan several different events around the world. There's one where people ride these they call them monkey bikes. They're like these little tiny motorcycles, but they're almost like children's bicycles. So they're very tiny, and people ride them across like Morocco through the desert. Or I think they also have one where they ride them in Peru. They have another event called a rickshaw run in India, where people drive these little rickshaws, these little like 3-wheeled, carts from like north to south of India. And these things are so tiny to fit your gear in, and sometimes you go over a bump and then they flip over, and so I feel like those events are a lot harder than this. And I mean, this obviously had its challenges, the Mongol Rally, but those are even harder in many ways. But this with the Mongol Rally, it seems like in the big scheme of things that this is the easiest of their events, because pretty much everyone knows how to drive a car. And obviously they haven't driven a car in some of the places that we've been to and under the challenging circumstances we went to, but at least how to drive a car to begin with. So it's open to anyone who wants to participate.
Wow, that's good. So I'm curious, why did you decide to join? What's the reason behind that?
So the backstory is that my brother Drew and I usually take a big trip every year, and we usually over Christmas and New Year's time, because we don't have a lot of close family left that lives near us, and we figured we might as well go somewhere interesting instead of just sitting home and making Christmas dinner for ourselves. So each year, we began this tradition where one year we went to Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands. We went to Thailand and Cambodia one year. We went to Alaska and learned to dog sled. So then one year we were in Cuba. And we were in a tour group that year. We don't usually go in tour groups, but we figured Cuba is a little bit difficult to get around as tourists, and we would join a tour group. And there were a number of other people from around the world who were in our tour group, including this woman, Rosie, and her husband, Alan. They're both British, but now they live in Australia. And we had a really bad tour guide. He kind of got drunk and abandoned our group one evening. And so all of us in the tour group kind of bonded and became good friends. And we created a Facebook group, and we kept in touch after the trip. We all went back home, and we kept in touch with Rosie and her husband, Alan. And then a few months later, Rosie contacted us, and she said, "Hey, I'm planning this big crazy trip with my best friend Jane, and we're planning on going on this event I heard about called the Mongol Rally. And would you and your brother like to join us?" And so we were, when we heard about that, it sounded very exciting. And I had known that Rosie was planning on doing this trip. She had mentioned it when we were in Cuba. But for some reason, until she actually invited us and said, "Hey, do you want to go?" That the thought, I hadn't gotten the thought in my mind that, oh, you could do this also. And once she asked me that, I immediately, my brother and I were super excited, and we didn't have to think about it for very long before we said, yes, we would definitely like to do this. And then it was pretty early on in that process that I thought, because I'm a journalist and I have this background working in radio for many years, that I should record and document our whole experience and make a podcast out of it. So I decided to do that. So we jumped in pretty quickly. And then once we decided to go, I mean, it took months and months of planning, as you could imagine, for a trip like this. You've got to figure out what kind of car to buy. You've got to plan the route you want to take. You've got to get all the visas you need and the vaccinations. There's just so much planning. It basically kind of took over our lives for 6 months or so. But then the trip finally began. And I remember setting out, that day 5 years ago, and we just had no idea what we were getting into. We had planned out the route, but we had never been to the vast majority of these countries, and we just, by the end, we were so amazed, how different it was than what we had expected, and in a good way. And we have so many memories looking back at that journey.
Wow. And what was your family and your friends' reaction when they heard about your trip?
I think certain people had some concerns, understandably, about us taking this journey. because we were going to parts of the world that they had never been to, or only heard bad things about on the news. For example, this was the summer of 2016, and it was just kind of very bad timing through no fault of our own, where we ended up at the border to enter Turkey 6 days after an attempted coup in Turkey. And so obviously we were a bit nervous and trying to figure out, is it still safe? Can we do that? We were scrambling around at the last minute to figure out, okay, what are our options? Is it safe to go that way? Is there a different way we can go? Do we have time to go another way? Can our visa let us go? If we have to drive north instead through Russia, does our visa allow enough entries and exits into and out of Russia to make that possible? But then if we go north through Russia, then we've got to drive through places like Chechnya, which might not be safe. That might not be a better option. Or do we put the car on a boat across the Black Sea, but then there's only one ferry a week, and that seems unreliable. So there's just so many different things you need to juggle and figure out in a case like this. So yeah, there was the complications with Turkey, and Turkey ended up being totally fine. You never would have known there was an attempted coup a week before, and people were so glad to see us, that like the hotel operators, the restaurant owners, because all the tourists had been scared away, and they were losing all this money, and so they were thrilled that we were there, because they really needed tourists to spend money to support their income. To be extra safe, we ended up kind of zooming through Turkey. Like, we didn't stop in Istanbul and Ankara, even though we really wanted to see Istanbul, but just to be extra safe, we ended up just passing them and driving through most of the country. Though we did stop in Cappadocia in central Turkey, which is a really amazing place. If you've heard about it, there's these stone caves, and it's a really cool place, and I'd love to go back and spend some more time. The other places where I think there were some concerns among our family members, especially our father, was going to Iran, because he has the perceptions of Iran that people are just going to be chanting death to America, and they you don't know what the situation is, and that ended up being totally fine as well. As Americans, if you're American, British, or Canadian, you have to hire a tour guide in order to take you through Iran. You can't go yourself. So we had a tour guide show us around, and it was fine. It not only fine, like it was amazing. Like the people in Iran were the friendliest, warmest people I've ever met in all my travels anywhere around the world. You'll meet people, complete strangers, and you talk with them. They want to come up, and they're so excited to see you. They've never met Americans before. They didn't even know Americans could visit their country, and they want to practice their English. They know all sorts of things about American culture more than I knew, from watching television. We met some young high school girl who met us in a park in downtown Tehran one day, and she started tagging along with us and hanging out. And she was studying Shakespeare in school, and her favorite TV show was Desperate Housewives, which is like this trash reality TV show here, which I don't even watch. Yeah, we would talk to complete strangers for 5 minutes, and suddenly they're inviting you to come to their home, come for tea, come for dinner, meet their families. Just such incredibly warm and friendly people. And then also Tajikistan, because people were concerned because we were driving on the Pamir Highway, which is supposed to be one of the roughest, most difficult roads in the world. And we were right across the border from Afghanistan for several days, and people were worried about that. But that ended up being totally fine as well. We would drive through we felt totally safe on the side where we were, on the Tajik side, and we would drive through these little towns, and all these children were used to seeing all these other Mongol Rally teams drive through. And so we'd go through these little villages, and the children would stand on the side of the road with their arms out to give us high fives as we drove past. So it was just really neat. And we really never felt unsafe.
There is only one river, right, between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So unless you cross the river or swim there, it's pretty much safe.
Right, yeah, and I should let people know, for most of that journey on the Afghan side, it's just like sheer cliff faces, just giant, rocks, like straight up. Like, there were some areas where we would see some people off in the distance, walking down the road, or we saw some like children playing soccer, playing football, like on the beach. And so it's like within shouting distance. If we wanted, we could probably shout back and forth to the people. But it's also this giant raging river, like class 5 rapids between us and them. So we felt pretty safe on our side. I mean, I guess someone could shoot a gun across, I suppose. But and there was that incident a few years later. I have to mention I guess the Taliban incident on the Tajik side where those bicyclists were killed.
Oh yeah. 2008.
So Right. A few years after we went, so there have been some instances, but I think that's few and far between. That was kind of a rare circumstance when that happened, is my understanding. And for the most part, all of these groups from the Mongol Rally drive through on the Pamir Highway year after year, and there've never been any incidents. So and it's beautiful scenery. I think of all the countries we went to, and I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking to people in Tajikistan, yourself and your brother, but it was just the scenery, the mountains in Tajikistan. It was just incredible. Most scenic country, I think, of all the countries we went to. It's really amazing.
Oh yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And in your podcast, you say that the most memorable place was Iran. Why is that?
I think just there was the mystery and I don't know, it's hard to say. Maybe I said that in the podcast, but now that I'm thinking, it's so hard to pick one place out of all the places we went to. But yeah, I think Iran would be near the top of the list probably. But yeah, I think it was just kind of the intrigue of the country, like not knowing anything about it and knowing that it's a place that so few Americans or so few Westerners get to go to. So, it was just all new and foreign to my brother and myself. And just the fact that, we feel very lucky that we were able to visit this country that so many people aren't able to go to. And the people there felt so happy and excited that they were able to visit Westerners and that they were able to meet Westerners and Americans. So I think it was just kind of the uniqueness of the place is why Iran really sticks in my mind.
Yeah, very different from your expectations, right?
Yeah. And I don't know that I had a lot of expectations. Like, again, people were afraid of us going there. I had done some research and reading up ahead of time, and I had heard that, Iranians were incredibly friendly and warm and welcoming people, this sense of Persian hospitality. So I did have that expectation going in, but even so, actually experiencing it firsthand, it still blew me away. Like it went way above and beyond, surpassing my expectations.
Have you noticed any similarity between our Tajik language and Iranian? Because
if you don't know the language, it's hard to.
Yeah. Because it's pretty much the same. We can understand each other.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. No, I didn't realize that. Huh.
Ours is like Farsi Dari. It's a dialect of the same language. Persian, yeah. So we can understand each other.
Okay. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. And is Turkmen similar as well? Because that's in between your countries.
Turkmen, it's different.
Uzbek,
Turkmen, Uzbek, Turkish. They are like a different group.
Okay, interesting. Huh. Yeah, no, I did not recognize that. Fascinating.
Yeah. And you guys are vegetarian, right? You and your brother.
Yeah, we're pescatarians, so we eat fish, but that kind of doesn't matter in Central Asia because they don't really eat a lot of fish.
Yeah.
Like even in Mongolia, like no one eats fish. Like it's, some of these countries, it's just they're landlocked countries, and even if like Mongolia has a lot of lakes, but it's just a cultural thing, like no one eats fish, just like in Kazakhstan, a lot of people ate horse meat, and to us in the West, like we never dream of eating horse meat. So it's just a cultural thing people don't. Yeah, so that didn't really help us much at all. But yeah, just not eating meat, it could be a little bit of a challenge in some cases. It wasn't as much of a challenge as we were afraid of, and as people had warned us. It was funny because each country seemed to like have their own meat. Like in Iran, of course, people ate a lot of camel. In Tajikistan, especially like in rural parts of like in Murgab, in eastern Tajikistan, this town in the middle of nowhere that felt like it was kind of on the edge of the earth. We showed up at this hotel late at night, and we were lucky to even find a room. And we went to the hotel restaurant. And we had a choice of like 3 types of yak meat.
Wow.
And like I said, in Kazakhstan, they ate horse.
Wow.
So, but we ended up figuring it out, like at this hotel in Murgab, like where all they had was yak meat. They had some kind of soup. It was like a yak soup, but they ended up taking the meat out, and so we just had the soup without the yak meat. Like that's the best they could do, and that was fine. And even Mongolia, people warned us about the food in Mongolia. They said it's really not very good. Like traditional Mongolian food, like that the nomadic people eat, is apparently really not very good because they're in the middle of nowhere. They just don't have access to a lot of fresh ingredients. So they eat a lot of mutton, like old, like really tough sheep, meat. And they have this milk that I guess, a lot of people have like goats or sheep, and they like take the milk from that and they like ferment it into some kind of cheese, like this really kind of acidic, like these hard bricks of cheese. They're almost like hockey pucks, like you crack your teeth on them, and they're really acidic and really awful, apparently. But we mostly stayed in hotels. And the thing with traveling on this trip with our friends Rosie and Jane is that they're kind of two middle-aged women, like in their 50s. And so the vast majority of people who went on the Mongol Rally were a lot younger. They were mostly like kids, especially guys, like maybe in their 20s or 30s. And so Rosie and Jane were not in that demographic. They were a bit older. And so these young kids were like staying in hostels all the time. They were camping out in tents. And, Rosie and Jane, just being a little bit older, they liked their creature comforts. They liked something a little bit more comfortable, like staying in a hotel somewhere. So we ended up staying with them most of the time. So we weren't doing as much like camping out and staying in the middle of nowhere where maybe we would have had some more challenges with eating food. We stayed in hotels, and so usually they could find something on the menu or find a way to improvise to find something that we could eat, and it ended up working out.
Yeah, and tell us about your last day. So you arrived, and how was that?
So, like I said, it took us 7 weeks to go from the beginning to the end. And when we finally arrived in Ulan Ude, Siberia, just north of Mongolia, to the finish line, which is at this hotel, we were way behind schedule because we had so many breakdowns and car repairs along the way. So most of the teams had already arrived by that point. And so when we drove up there weren't any people really to greet us or, any kind of celebration or anything. We just kind of drove there. And it felt kind of anticlimactic. Like it was a little bit disappointing.
No fireworks.
Because we were we were expecting more of kind of a celebration welcome party, but I understand that all the different teams come at different times, so there's no way they could have a party for every single one of the hundreds of teams. But so it was a little bit of a letdown in that way, but it still kind of felt like an enormous accomplishment because we had driven, 11,000 miles, 18,000 kilometers through 18 countries. And along that way, we had visited 10 mechanics. We had gotten towed 7 times. We broke the rear axle of our car twice. We blew our head gasket, which was a major thing I didn't even talk about. That's like a really big car repair where they have to take the whole engine apart and replace basically we blew this head gasket in Turkmenistan and they wouldn't extend our visa. So we had to put the car on a tow truck and get towed 6 hours to the border of Uzbekistan and then wait a week for a new head gasket to get shipped from Dubai.
Wow.
So that was, a giant ordeal where they had to take the whole engine apart and then rebuild it. So we had to have that done. We got a hole in our radiator at one point. We blew our tire out, and then we had to get rescued once in Mongolia when we got stranded in the middle of nowhere. So all these things happened during these 7 weeks. And then to finally make it to the finish line, it felt like such an accomplishment. We were so proud of ourselves and so amazed. There were many times where we never imagined that we would reach it.
Wow. And at the end, what happened to your beloved car?
So you can't just leave the car in Mongolia or in Russia because then you have to pay import fees and, it's kind of complicated. So all of the cars that, if you've driven the car there from Europe or from the UK, you need to somehow get it back to Europe, so you don't have to pay a big fee. So for most of the people who drove on the rally, the organizers of the event, one of the few things that they organized, they arranged for us to drive the car to a train depot, and like a freight train depot, and we left the cars there and we signed some paperwork, and then they put the cars onto this freight train, and they shipped all of our vehicles back to the UK. I think they took them to, Lithuania, Latvia or Lithuania, one of those, or it might have been Estonia, I don't know, one of those countries. And then they brought them to a junkyard and got rid of them. So at least they were back in the EU, and so then we didn't have to pay the import fees. So we did that with our car, because our car had all kinds of trouble. But then our friends Rosie and Jane actually wanted to keep her vehicle. So I decided that I wanted to continue driving. I wanted to drive all the way back to see more places I had never been to and gather more stories for my podcast. So I didn't go back the same way I went, because that would have been kind of totally crazy and take a long time, and just with all the visas it would have been difficult. But I drove back a different route. I drove back a more northern route, kind of across Siberia, and so I got to see a big chunk of Russia. I went back down into Kazakhstan and went to Astana, which I didn't get to see on the way there. And then I went to Ukraine, went to Chernobyl, which is the most fascinating, eeriest place I've ever been to. And then back across the rest of Europe, across Germany and Amsterdam, and then put the car back on a ferry that I went back to the UK and brought it back to Jane's house, and she was very excited to see it. Oh, wow. So that's the story of how I went. I drove back it took 11,000 miles going there and about another 7,000 miles driving home, so 18,000 miles round trip, or 29,000 kilometers. Basically around a quarter of the way around the earth and back on this journey.
It sounds quite expensive. Who covered all the expenses? Yourself?
It was a variety of different ways. So we had to pay some of this ourselves. We also had a lot of online support from friends and family members. We had, online crowdfunding, partially to raise money for charity for the event, but then people also donated quite a bit, like several $1,000s, to help cover a lot of our expenses on the journey. And we had some sponsors, which helped as well, like businesses where we'd put their sticker on the side of our car, and in return they agreed to make a donation. So, a variety of different ways.
Yeah, I see. I'm curious, what is your biggest takeaway from the trip? Maybe there are many. Yeah,
I think there are a few different takeaways. I think one of them is that people are, there's several, I could say. The world, people often say it's a small world, and it's especially nowadays where you could just hop on a plane and be on the other side of the planet in 24 hours. And people think that, tourists have visited everywhere, and there's not many places you could go nowadays that aren't on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. But it's true in some ways that it's a small world, but in other ways, the world is very big in between the big cities that everyone goes to. There's vast stretches of kind of beautiful scenery and just like places where no one lives, but it's just unexplored areas, or not explored as thoroughly. And so, yes, in some ways it's a small world, but in between the cities, it's actually a very big world, and there's so much to explore. I guess another takeaway is that people were afraid of us going to some of these places, to, like to Iran, for example. And I think people are afraid of things that they don't know. They're afraid of things...
Uncertainty.
They're afraid of uncertainty, things that are unfamiliar. And my biggest takeaway is that wherever you go, anywhere around the world, people are generally good people. Even if they don't speak your language, even if it's a different culture, a different religion, if you're broken down at the side of the road, people will be willing to help you out, or you're terribly lost and you need to figure out how to get to the next town. Like we didn't speak the language in most of these places. They didn't speak English, but we managed somehow to sort of communicate. and people helped us out, and they helped us fix our car. They helped give us directions to tell us where we could find a mechanic, where we could get help. Wherever you go, despite whatever differences you might have with other people are generally good people. And I think that's my biggest takeaway, that the world isn't as big and bad and scary as some people might be afraid of.
Yeah, and what would be your advice to some people who would like to do the same thing?
I feel like we spent so much time trying to prepare for this event and get so many different supplies and do all this research because we didn't know what we were getting into, and we wanted to try to be prepared. But in the end, we had all these things that went wrong that we had no way of knowing to prepare for. We brought all these spare parts for our car. My brother and I had never driven a stick shift car before, so we had to learn that. And we were afraid we would burn out the clutch, so we brought an extra clutch for the car in case we needed to replace that. That ended up being fine. We had other mechanical problems. We blew a head gasket. We didn't know to bring that. Like we brought extra belts. We didn't end up using it. And we brought, all kinds of first aid kits. You want to have a first aid kit, but then we brought they call it an AED. Like it's like if someone has a heart attack in the middle of nowhere, to give them a shock, to it's like for first aid, which it was kind of this big expensive device that we got, And we're glad. I guess we're glad we had it because God forbid if something had happened and we were in the middle of nowhere, But we didn't end up using the vast majority of things that we brought with us. So I guess that would be part of my advice, to just not worry too much. Do your best, but don't freak out about thinking, okay, you need to have all these supplies and you need to have all this training and everything. Because there's no way you could fully prepare for a trip like this. You could do your best, but other sorts of things will go wrong, So just, I guess, be calm and don't worry if things don't go exactly your way. On a journey like this, you've got to be okay with uncertainty and with the unexpected. And when things don't go your way, you just kind of have to roll with the punches and deal with it, make the best of a bad situation. And, in the end, you'll have great stories to tell, hopefully, I think that's kind of my biggest takeaway. And ideally, if you'd have a better vehicle also, again, you have to follow the rules of the event. And we, like I said, we did get our vehicle checked out ahead of time by a mechanic who seemed to think things were okay, and then we still had trouble. So again, you can only do so much, but I guess do what you can to see if you could try to get a vehicle that won't break down too many times like ours did.
Yeah, so be flexible and just enjoy the ride.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good advice. And I would recommend listening to your podcast because it seems like you recorded, you documented everything, every moment.
Yes.
Yeah, there are so many details.
Yeah.
We would highly recommend to listen to your podcast. It's called Far From Home, right?
Right, yes. And people could find it wherever they get their podcasts, or they could find my website is farfromhomepodcast.org, or search for it on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. And yes, I documented, I recorded audio of every experience and encounter because I really wanted to try to bring my listeners along with me on the journey. So I'm not just talking about the trip, but they could actually listen along and feel like they're there with me. So that was my goal.
Yeah, you can feel that because you added some audios from your trip. So you can really feel that. Yeah, it seems like you are there. It's really cool. It's cool. And Scott,
do you think I have a question for you? Do you think, I don't know, did you hear the episodes from Tajikistan that I did yet?
About Tajikistan?
No. Okay.
There was some. Which episode?
There were a couple of episodes when I was driving through Tajikistan. I was just curious if you had happened to hear them, what you thought if I did a fair job portraying your country.
Yeah, we haven't heard the one about Tajikistan.
Okay.
But I heard that you had some difficulties with visa process. Yeah.
No, thankfully no visa issues in Tajikistan. A lot of it was just more car difficulty, but unfortunately there was a situation where there were some police officers who pulled us over, and they were trying to take a bribe, and they aimed the radar gun at another car and they were trying to say that we were speeding, and so we had to give them a bottle of vodka. That was kind of unfortunate. But then there was another much more positive situation where we ended up stranded on the Pamir Highway and in the absolute middle of nowhere, and then some young kids came along and they ended up giving a tow to my brother and myself, and I guess not to Murghab. It was a city a little bit before Murghab, but again, we didn't really speak the language. We couldn't communicate well, but they were really great and super helpful, and that was a really cool experience as well. So it's a highly I highly recommend if anyone is. Tajikistan is not a place most people think to go to. It's this kind of little corner of Central Asia, but I highly recommend it if anyone ever gets a chance, and especially if you could drive through to see it. It's a really cool country.
Yeah, thank you. And even us, people from the north part of Tajikistan, we can't understand them. People in Pamir, they have their own language.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And have you ever been there in the GBAO territory? I don't know how much people have even traveled around their own country, so but it's a fascinating place.
Yeah. But we haven't been to Murghab. It's quite far. But
we've been to Shugnon, Bukharok.
Yes, the capital of the
Pamir.
Pamir, yeah.
Right.
Okay, Scott, any other closing thoughts from you before we wrap things up? Anything to share?
I guess my final thought is that when you're in the middle of all these situations, like we were, like this time in Mongolia where we got absolutely stranded in the middle of nowhere and there's no one around for miles and miles, and we needed to call for help, and we ended up having to get rescued by the Mongolian National Emergency Management Agency. When you're in the middle of these situations, and it's really sometimes scary and even depressing, and you're like, what have I gotten myself into? I wish I were just back home, sleeping in my nice bed, eating a nice meal, in the comfortable air conditioning or heat or whatever. You wonder, you have second thoughts sometimes, but it all kind of makes for a better story in the end. Like, you get home, you're safe, hopefully, and then you look back at your pictures, you think back on your memories, and, even though in the moment you were thinking, what the hell have I gotten myself into? The aftermath, looking back in retrospect, it leaves you with much better stories, and I think that's the point of travel, to have these wonderful memories, to have these incredible stories. If I go to a party now or I meet strangers and I start telling them about my trip, and suddenly everyone's coming around me, they all want to hear, about the journey, and you become the most fascinating person at the party now. So travel has a tendency to do that. So I'm a big fan of traveling and getting outside of your comfort zone, not just going on like a cruise ship or going to Disney World or something, but really going to places that most tourists wouldn't go, and also traveling slower, not just zooming through on a tour, but if you could spend a little bit more time in a place to really get to know the culture and the people and to understand, how things work there on the ground. I highly recommend that.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, we haven't covered a lot in this episode, and for our listeners, if they would like to know more about this, they can go to your podcast, Far From Home, and just
everything is there.
Everything is there, and just enjoy it. And it really might be useful for some people who would like to do that. And
even if you don't, it's interesting to know about that.
It's quite interesting, yeah. And after listening to this, maybe some people will think like, I can do that as well. And it will give them some idea how it looks like.
I'd be thrilled if I could motivate some other people to kind of get out of their comfort zones and try, maybe not even if it's not a trip this big, but maybe it's just doing something you've never done before. Or going to, even during this time of coronavirus when people can't travel so far and go on crazy adventures like I did, maybe you can just go explore an area close to where you live that you've never been to, or try a new cuisine, food from a different part of the world that you've never had before. Like, I'm just a big fan of people trying new things. So even if it's not like a big crazy journey like I did, even just taking small steps, if I could encourage people to do that, I'd be so happy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott, for sharing all of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.